The world entered 2026 with its eyes fixed elsewhere. Some were watching Venezuela, others were focused on Iran, the Middle East, and rising global tensions. But while the headlines looked away, something far more unsettling was unfolding quietly in Burkina Faso. In the early days of January, whispers began to circulate. Then the reports grew louder. An attempted military coup, not rumor, not speculation, but a carefully coordinated plot was already in motion. And unlike past coups in West Africa, this one did not announce itself with tanks in the streets or gunfire at dawn. This one was meant to happen silently. What makes this moment chilling is not just the plot itself, but how early it was stopped. Since September 2022, when Ibrahim Traoré came to power, Burkina Faso has undergone a transformation that many outside Africa still refuse to acknowledge. Power has shifted, intelligence has been rebuilt, loyalty has been redefined. And for the first time in years, the state began acting before chaos could erupt, not after. This was not a spontaneous rebellion. This was not an angry mob or a rogue unit acting alone. According to multiple reports, this was a revenge coup organized from exile involving disgruntled insiders and most shockingly linked to terrorist elements that have terrorized the Sahel for years. The goal was brutal and precise: remove key figures, create instability, and let violence do the rest. But the plan never reached the streets. No shots were fired, no sirens warned the public, because the arrests happened quietly one by one before the first move could be made. And then something extraordinary happened. As news of the failed coup attempt spread, the people of Burkina Faso did not hide. They came out by the thousands. In Ouagadougou, in Bobo-Dioulasso. Ordinary citizens standing openly saying the same thing with their presence. This is our leader. This is our choice. So here is the question. Many in the West are uncomfortable asking if democracy truly means the will of the people. What do we call it? When the people themselves step into the streets to defend a leader without being forced, without being paid, without fear. And why at such a critical moment has much of Western media remained so quiet? Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's leadership is legitimate, even without elections? Can popular support outweigh ballots in times of national survival? Please share this video if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines, and subscribe if you think Africa deserves to tell its own story without distortion. The attempted coup that nearly shook Burkina Faso in early January 2026 did not begin with gunfire. It began with planning, resentment, and unfinished business from the past. At the center of this plot was a familiar name, Henry Damiba. Damiba is not a fringe figure or an unknown agitator. He is the former transitional leader of Burkina Faso, a man who himself came to power through a military coup in January 2022, overthrowing President Roch Kabore. Less than 8 months later, in September 2022, he was removed from office by Ibrahim Traoré, a younger officer who accused Damiba of losing focus, abandoning the fight against terrorism, and becoming consumed by political maneuvering. After his removal, Damiba fled the country and settled into exile in Togo. That exile is where the story truly begins. According to reports cited in the transcript, Damiba did not retreat into silence or political retirement. Instead, he allegedly maintained active communication with contacts inside Burkina Faso, both within the military and among civilian collaborators. These were described as disgruntled elements, individuals unhappy with the new direction of the country, resistant to reforms, or personally loyal to the old order. But dissatisfaction alone was not the engine of this plot. What elevates this attempted coup from internal dissent to a national security emergency is the allegation that Damiba and his collaborators sought assistance from Jnim, the jihadist organization that has spent years destabilizing Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso through massacres, kidnappings, and territorial control. The plan, as outlined, was calculated and cold. First, remove key military figures within the inner circle of President Traoré through targeted stealth assassinations. Not a broad attack, not open warfare, just enough to decapitate command and sow confusion. Second, exploit the resulting instability by activating Jnim cells to escalate violence, turning confusion into chaos. And finally, present the collapse of order as justification for a return to leadership by those who claimed they could restore control. In simple terms, terrorism was not an obstacle to this plan. It was a tool. This is the moment where the transcript pauses and asks a question that many viewers, especially older Americans familiar with Cold War politics and proxy conflicts, instinctively understand. How can a man who once sat at the head of a nation justify working with the very forces that have been killing his own people? For context, this question cuts deep in Burkina Faso. By the time Damiba was removed in 2022, nearly 40% of the country's territory was under some level of influence or control by terrorist groups. Villages were emptied, roads became death traps, schools closed, entire communities lived in fear. Damiba had come to power promising security. He left office accused of neglecting it. Now, according to these reports, the same man was allegedly willing to collaborate with those responsible for the bloodshed he once claimed he would end. That contradiction is not just political, it is moral. And it reframes the coup attempt entirely. This was not a struggle over ideology, not a disagreement over policy, not a debate about elections or constitutions. It was a struggle over power pursued at any cost. What the plotters underestimated fatally was how much Burkina Faso had changed since 2022. They assumed the state was still fragmented. They assumed loyalties were divided. They assumed intelligence systems were weak as they had been under previous governments. They were wrong, very wrong. And in the next part, we will examine how this plot was uncovered before a single shot was fired, and why the intelligence reforms under President Traoré changed the outcome entirely. The most striking detail about this attempted coup in Burkina Faso is not how violent it was, but how violence never had the chance to begin. There were no tanks rolling through the capital, no gunfire echoing through the night, no last-minute radio announcements declaring a change of power. And that is precisely why this moment matters. According to the transcript, the plot reached its most dangerous phase, not on the streets, but in private conversations, messages, calls, and quiet coordination between exiled figures, disgruntled insiders, and external militant elements. This was not a crude emotional uprising. It was designed to be surgical. The plan hinged on surprise. Targeted assassinations were meant to remove key figures within the military leadership loyal to Ibrahim Traoré. Not a broad purge just enough to fracture command and create paralysis. In that moment of confusion, terrorist networks already operating in the Sahel would escalate attacks, turning uncertainty into panic. From the outside, it would appear as though the state had lost control. That illusion of collapse was meant to be the doorway back to power. But the doorway never opened. What the plotters did not understand or refuse to believe is that Burkina Faso's intelligence architecture is no longer what it was before 2022. Following Traoré's rise to power, the country undertook a quiet but extensive reorganization of its intelligence services. Fragmented units were consolidated, command structures were simplified, surveillance and communications monitoring were modernized. Most importantly, intelligence shifted from reaction to anticipation. Instead of responding to attacks after civilians were killed or soldiers were ambushed, the focus moved to identifying patterns, monitoring communications, and mapping networks before action could be taken. This is where the coup attempt unraveled. According to the account, the intelligence services detected unusual communication flows between external actors and individuals inside Burkina Faso. These communications were not intercepted once or twice, they were monitored over time. Locations were identified, roles were clarified, the structure of the plot became visible, and then the state waited. This detail is critical. Rather than rushing in prematurely and risking exposure, authorities allowed the plotters to believe they were still operating in secrecy. Only when the final phase was approaching did security forces act quietly, arresting individuals one by one, without spectacle, without public announcements, without provoking resistance. By the time the public learned of the coup attempt, it had already failed. This is the climax of the story, but it is not where the emotional peak occurs. The emotional peak came afterward. As news of the thwarted coup spread, something unexpected happened. Instead of fear, silence, or confusion, people came out into the streets. In Ouagadougou, in Bobo Dioulasso, in other towns across the country, ordinary citizens, young people, workers, families marched openly in support of the government. They were not celebrating violence. They were rejecting instability. Their message was clear: this chapter is closed. For many older Americans watching from afar, this reaction may seem unfamiliar. In much of the Western imagination, coups are elite affairs, soldiers versus politicians, power traded behind closed doors. The public is expected to endure the outcome, not shape it. But in Burkina Faso, the public response changed the meaning of the event. Even if the plot had progressed further, even if chaos had briefly taken hold, the transcript argues that it would not have lasted. A government without popular backing may seize power overnight, but it cannot survive daylight. This is why the coup failed twice. First, it failed operationally because intelligence detected it early. Second, it failed politically because the people refused to accept it. The reaction on the streets sent a message not just to the plotters, but to anyone watching from outside the country. Power in Burkina Faso no longer rests solely in barracks or ministries. It rests in public consent. And that reality reshapes everything: how coups are planned, how governments survive, and how legitimacy is measured. In the next section, we will step back and examine why this pattern keeps repeating in Burkina Faso's history, and what truly separates this moment from the coups that came before it. When an attempted coup collapses before it begins, the damage is not measured in casualties, but in what it reveals. And in Burkina Faso, the aftermath of this failed plot exposed a profound shift in both civilian psychology and political reality. For years, coups in Burkina Faso followed a familiar pattern. Power changed hands. The public waited. Life went on, often with more uncertainty than before. But this time the reaction was different. Civilians did not retreat into their homes. They stepped forward. In cities like Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, people gathered openly not to celebrate a takeover, but to reject one. That distinction matters. It signals a population that no longer sees coups as inevitable interruptions, but as unacceptable threats to daily survival. This civilian response is not accidental. It is the result of lived experience. Between 2014 and 2022, Burkina Faso endured repeated political ruptures. After the popular uprising that forced Blaise Compaoré from power in 2014, hope briefly surged only to fade as insecurity worsened. Under Roch Kaboré, terrorism, expanded state authority weakened, and communities were left exposed. When Henry Damiba took power in 2022, expectations were high, but his focus drifted toward political management rather than battlefield realities. The cost was paid by civilians. Villages emptied, schools closed, markets disappeared, families learned to measure distance not in miles, but in risk. This is the context in which Ibrahim Traoré emerged. His legitimacy, as portrayed in the transcript, is not rooted in constitutional paperwork or international approval. It is rooted in perceived protection. For ordinary people, the most basic political question is not who was elected, but who is keeping us alive. Politically, this changes everything. The failed coup has reinforced a new social contract, one where security precedes procedure. Many citizens appear willing to delay elections, suspend traditional timelines, and endure international criticism if it means stability is restored first. For Western audiences accustomed to orderly transitions, this may feel uncomfortable, but for communities living under the constant threat of violence, it feels practical. The consequences extend beyond borders. Organizations like ECOWAS have long insisted on rapid returns to electoral rule, often without addressing the conditions that made governance impossible in the first place. The events of January 2026 challenge that logic. They suggest that legitimacy cannot be imposed on a society still under siege. At the same time, the failure of the coup sends a warning to political actors inside Burkina Faso. Alliances with destabilizing forces, even for personal ambition, will not be tolerated, not by the state, and increasingly not by the public. This moment also narrows the space for future power grabs. When coups fail quietly and publicly, their mystique fades. They stop being bold acts of change and start looking like reckless gambles with civilian lives. In that sense, the greatest consequence of this failed coup is not that a government survived, but that the rules of political survival have changed. In the next section, we will widen the lens and examine how this event fits into the broader geopolitical landscape, including Western reactions, regional alliances, and why silence can sometimes speak louder than condemnation. To understand the significance of this failed coup in Burkina Faso, we have to step outside West Africa and look at how the world, particularly the United States and its allies, responded. Or more accurately, how they did not respond. In recent years, Western media outlets have shown remarkable consistency in covering events in the Sahel. Terrorist attacks are reported quickly. Suicide bombings, ambushes, and militant advances often dominate headlines. When instability erupts, the story is framed as another example of African chaos, another failed state spiraling out of control. But when a coup attempt is stopped, before a single shot is fired, the silence becomes noticeable. According to the narrative in the transcript, Western outlets barely acknowledged the event. There were no urgent panels, no breaking news banners, no deep analysis of how a government managed to neutralize a serious threat without bloodshed. For many observers in Africa, that absence feels deliberate. From a U.S. perspective, this silence raises uncomfortable questions. Washington has long positioned itself as a defender of democracy abroad, particularly electoral democracy. Yet in much of West Africa, elections have become increasingly symbolic, marred by constitutional manipulation, exclusion of opposition candidates, and disputed results. Governments that maintain formal democratic structures often preside over insecurity and economic decline while retaining international legitimacy. Burkina Faso disrupts that pattern. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the country has postponed elections, centralized power, and openly rejected external political pressure. In return, it has prioritized security and national control. Whether one agrees with this model or not, it presents a challenge to the dominant Western narrative that legitimacy flows only from ballots regardless of outcomes. This challenge becomes even sharper when viewed alongside global events. At the same time this coup attempt was unfolding, tensions were rising elsewhere, Venezuela facing renewed pressure, Iran confronting escalation, and broader cracks appearing in what some analysts call the unipolar order. In that context, governments that resist Western influence, whether in Latin America, the Middle East, or Africa, often experience coordinated political, economic, or informational pressure. From that vantage point, the attempted destabilization of Burkina Faso appears less isolated. Regionally, the situation is equally complex. The emergence of the alliance of Sahel states linking Burkina Faso with Mali and Niger has already disrupted established power structures in West Africa. The alliance openly rejects external military presence and seeks new security partnerships. That shift alone has redrawn geopolitical lines. Then there is Togo, where the alleged mastermind of the coup resides in exile. While no official accusation has been made, the perception that coup plotting could occur from foreign soil without consequence feeds regional mistrust. For observers, it reinforces the sense that political games are being played quietly behind diplomatic smiles. For American audiences, especially those who lived through the Cold War, these dynamics may feel familiar. Influence is rarely exerted openly. It moves through pressure, silence, selective outrage, and strategic neglect. The key question is not whether Burkina Faso fits Western expectations, but whether Western frameworks still fit African realities. Because in January 2026, a government survived, not because it pleased international partners, but because it retained internal cohesion and popular backing. And that reality forces a reconsideration of how power legitimacy and sovereignty are defined in a changing world. What happened in early January 2026 in Burkina Faso should not be dismissed as just another failed coup in a troubled region. That would be a mistake and a dangerous one. This was not a chaotic uprising. It was not a miscalculated mutiny. It was a deliberate, externally coordinated attempt to reverse a political direction that many powerful actors find uncomfortable. The most important warning from this event is simple: future attempts will not stop. When a government survives an attack like this quietly, efficiently, without bloodshed, it does not end the struggle. It raises the stakes. Those who lose through covert means rarely abandon their ambitions. They adapt. They wait. They look for new pressure points: economic, diplomatic, informational. That is why this moment matters beyond Burkina Faso. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the country has become a symbol of something larger unfolding across parts of Africa, a rejection of externally managed politics and a demand that security and sovereignty come before approval from abroad. Whether one agrees with that path or not, it is undeniable that it reflects a genuine shift in public sentiment. For ordinary citizens, the calculation is painfully practical. They ask not who is applauded internationally, but who keeps roads open, schools functioning, and villages alive. When people repeatedly step into the streets to defend a leader without coercion, that signals a form of legitimacy that no communique can manufacture. This creates a tension the world is still struggling to process. Western institutions continue to speak the language of elections and timelines, but in places where elections have become tools of entrenchment rather than accountability, that language no longer convinces. The silence surrounding this failed coup, especially when contrasted with the loud reporting of violence elsewhere, only deepens mistrust. And mistrust, once rooted, reshapes alliances. The lesson here is not that coups are good or that power should be unchecked. The lesson is that stability without legitimacy collapses, and legitimacy without popular consent is an illusion. Burkina Faso for now has found a balance its people recognize, even if outsiders do not. But this balance is fragile. The warning is clear: pressure will continue. Narratives will be contested, and attempts to correct Burkina Faso's direction may return in new forms. That is why understanding events like this before they are rewritten or forgotten matters. So let me leave you with these questions. Do you believe popular support can be a stronger foundation than ballots in times of national survival? Can we continue to trust Western narratives about Africa if critical events are ignored? And should leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré be judged only by process or also by outcomes? If you believe the truth is often quieter than the headlines, please share this video. If you think Africa deserves to define its own future, subscribe and stay with us. And most importantly, tell us what you think in the comments, because this conversation is far from over.